Hey guys, welcome back to Behind the Mic Conversations of Hope. You know, we've had some episodes on pornography in the past, and some of you wonder, why do we talk about this so much? Being at Covenant Eyes, I have seen more in the past year of how pornography is destroying the core of a family, of marriages, of relationships. And I recently read a book that just came out by Bob and Dannah Gresh, and asked them to join us on the podcast today to talk about the topic of that book. You guys have an amazing testimony. Bob and Dannah, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's great being here.
It's our pleasure.
Let's talk about who you guys are. So you both are authors, podcasters. You guys do it all, basically. And the book that I'm referring to is not Happily Ever After, but Happily Even After. That's a leading title there. So let's talk about that. You guys are familiar with the problem of pornography very intimately. Can you talk a little bit about that and what the purpose of this book was?
Well, since I was about 12 years old, I have struggled with pornography on and off in a cyclical way. I always tell people, I remember the first time I saw pornography. I know where I was. I know what it was like. I know the heat in the room. It was like it makes me think of it as a real, spiritual warfare experience, I guess, because many people remember that. If you ask guys if they remember the first time they viewed pornography, a lot of people know that. But it became a real struggle in my life. I was always pretty open about it and transparent, but there didn't seem to be a lot of answers. And that started escalating into other things. And at some point, I had to sit down with Dannah a few years ago, and I guess the phrase I used was, "I need to tell you something because my only way back to God is probably to break your heart and explain to you what I've been doing and the things I've been struggling with." And that was a really rough time. And we've had access to some resources that maybe other people don't have access to, but I've found that what helps me the most is accountability daily, not just weekly. And I was thinking this morning about what I would be doing if I hadn't had this struggle. Would I have been active with other men? Would I have participated a lot? I think what keeps me participating with men in community is the battle I face with lust and pornography and how it affected our marriage.
Good.
You know, so what I've seen through Covenant Eyes, and Bob, by the way, I'm with you. I remember that first time that I saw that, and it's like your senses are just very heightened, and you remember that. It's like an experience. And, for me and probably most guys, it was out of curiosity. And fairly an innocent moment, but it quickly turns into something that spirals out of control. I mentioned working for Covenant Eyes, and I've heard stories from so many people that are using Covenant Eyes and how their lives are destroyed by it. I think it's important to understand that this is an issue. It's even scientific, and in your book you go through some of that and why this is so addictive. And I know you don't necessarily like the word addiction, but it really is that feeling of this is out of control in my life. You also allude to the fact that, hey, when you get married, it's not going to be a problem anymore. Can you guys speak to that?
Well, I think we both believed that when we got married, it would go away. Because Bob was really honest with me before we got married that he was struggling with this. And we just thought, it'll stop.
Right, sure. Once you get married and you can actually have sex, why would you participate? Back then it was magazines, but why would you look at things when you can actually do things, right?
Yeah, right.
But I think we find that that's a lie that a lot of couples fell for. And so lust and pornography have almost nothing to do with real sex, which God created to be about intimacy. The mechanics of it are just a piece of the greater purpose, which is growing closer in intimacy with each other. And of course, pornography aborts you from intimacy entirely. So they're really not related. And for me, as a wife who was heartbroken by it, the science was really an important piece for me in developing empathy for the battle he was facing. I think so many times wives react with hatred and anger and punishment or self-loathing. This is my fault. I'm not beautiful enough. Da 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 da. And those two polar opposites don't really move you towards a solution. But when you start to understand the science of it, when I started to understand the science of it, I had empathy for him. And my vows kicked in. In sickness or in health, I promised to care for him. He promised to care for me. And pornography, if you really study the addiction model, which it's not that we don't like the word addiction, it's that we use it carefully because it can be a word that we use to replace sin. But what began as a sin problem, or even if you go back to little boy Bob, I don't know that it was a sin problem. It was a curiosity problem that then morphed into a sin problem that then became an addiction or brain problem because the chemical of dopamine, which is created in the brain when you look at pornography or experience any kind of pleasure, is really damaging if you overdose on it. And it's part of the reason why a heroin addict's brain is so pockmarked and destroyed. And if you put a heroin addict's brain next to a porn addict's brain, they look almost the same. They are eaten up. Now we're not talking about like, this is the functional ability of a brain scan that shows how a brain is functioning. Looks like Swiss cheese. That's how destroyed a brain is after cyclical use of pornography. And when I saw that, I changed from a woman who was ticked off at my husband or in that self-loathing place, because I vacillated, right? To a woman who was like, okay, for right now, I have to be strong enough to help my husband who's not well. Yeah. And that was a big change for me, a shift in my heart and my mind.
I think that's so important because I think the way you experienced it is very natural, a natural reaction. You know, you've hurt me. How can you look at anybody else? Why am I not good enough? Those things that I've heard over and over again. And I think that the change can really begin, not that those things are not valid, because they are, but the change can begin when you see it the way you're talking about. It's so important to understand that this really is that type of addiction, and how physiologically it affects you. And I don't know how to. I mean, Covenant Eyes has an ebook called Your Brain on Porn, and I think that helps explain the physiological part of that too, and why that dopamine rush and all that stuff, how it all fits together and really becomes an issue. You know, it's not just something you can say I'm done with. It really is an addictive issue. One of the things so there's actually two things I want to talk to you about quickly, and that's we have a lot of resources out there for men and even women who are struggling with pornography. We see stats that say 7 out of 10 guys in the church are struggling with pornography. 1 out of 3 women are struggling with pornography. So there's a lot of resources out there for those who are struggling. But for the married couples, and this is your case, Dannah, when Bob comes to you and tells you this and drops this heavy load on you, we've got resources for him. But there's not a lot of resources out there for women or for the spouse whose husband or wife is dealing with this pornographic struggle. And that's what your book really tackles. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because that's an important issue that the society overlooks.
Absolutely. I've described it as it felt like Bob was driving our car down the road and he drove us into a tree. And the ambulance comes and it triages both of us. We're both bloody, but his injuries are much more life-threatening than mine. So the ambulance puts him in a gurney, they bandage him up, and I can hear the siren fading into the distance as I sit there and think, what about me? Who's going to take care of me?
Yeah.
And there's 2 answers to that. One is that I had to learn that I had to take care of me. That I had to, and that's a hard truth. Some of the hardest truths I heard were the most heart-saving truths. But you do have to do your own work. The husband has to do his work. The wife has to do her work. And then when you do your work independently, you are so much more effective when you come together. But I did go through a lot of years of just reading stuff that hurt, like added salt to the wounds that his pornography addiction had created. Because the traditional old model was, oh, you're codependent. If you're married to an addict, you must be a co-addict. And that was the conventional wisdom for a long time. And then they started to look at the brains of women and get to know them. And they said, no, this woman isn't a co-addict, but she's experiencing some trauma and she's not herself right now. And they would see these women go from strong, independent, capable community contributors to not well women. And then with the right nurturing and health, they would get well again. And what they discovered is that about 70% of wives who are married to pornography addicts are experiencing symptoms of PTSD. Now, that doesn't mean they have PTSD. It's not a diagnosis. But for a period of time, that's the power of the impact that the pornography has, that cycle, that not knowing what's true and what's not true. Bob wasn't really deceptive with me, but he didn't want to hurt me. I never caught Bob. He confessed his sin, but he didn't want to hurt me. And I knew there was something. You just know. Your body tells you there's something wrong before your heart is really even ready to admit it. So we wanted to create something that was predominantly for the wives first, because there's such a vacuum of that out there.
Yeah.
And then we have a podcast so we can bring the husbands into the conversation.
And I was deceptive in the way that I manipulated situations. I would only answer the questions that were asked of me. I'd be, very specific about the answers. And so it does, what I saw happening was it started to have, I didn't realize this at the time, and I couldn't understand at the time, but I could start to pinpoint the times I was acting out and her health issues. Like sometimes within an hour, I'd be like, she was doing okay, and then I did this, and she immediately, it kept lining up, and I found that's what really pushed me over the edge, was I felt like I had brought sin into the house, and spiritual warfare was happening. I didn't understand the physical thing. Since Dannah's research, we've researched it, and we see that there is a physical, physical consequences to the guy struggling, one spouse struggling with porn. It does have sometimes physical effects on the other one without even knowing it.
Yeah,
which I find absolutely fascinating.
And like we understand that now. So what kind of happens is, you're seeing things like maybe your husband's not making eye contact with you, or if he's escalated outside of porn into meeting people or anything like that, he's not present, he's not in the house as much as he's supposed to be, or he's traveling more often, or he's just not emotionally present when his body is in the room. Yeah. And a wife in her naivete wants to say, oh, he's just stressed out at work. So you kind of excuse all these things away. Meanwhile, your body is creating an inflammation response in you to say, pay attention to what is right under your nose. There's great science to prove this. And as you become more and more inflamed, you might have immune problems, you might have joint problems, you might experience breathing or digestive problems. Inflammation rather is at the root of a lot of things.
Yeah.
And we talked to a woman the other day who said she was diagnosed with lupus after her husband had multiple affairs. And fast forward, their marriage did survive it, and he really started walking in integrity, and her lupus suddenly was healed.
Wow.
And the science really supports that is possible. So
it's not always that way.
It's not always.
We can't blame every
Sure.
diagnosis on that in any way.
That's a very important thing
Sure.
to say, is just because you have cold or you have lupus, whatever, doesn't mean that you need to not trust your husband, but they may be connected.
Yeah. That's a great point. And I think there's a couple things that from the book, I pulled so many golden nuggets out of that. It was just really great. We'll talk about the book specifically, but resources out there for the women. You're doing that now, and I love that, and thank you for doing that. The other thing is, you had a quote in your book that says, look around, people in your church are in recovery from 1,000 different kinds of enslavement to sin. I think that we feel like, and I know the guy's viewpoint, or the one that is addicted to porn or has a porn issue, feels like the shame takes over. We're not qualified really to do much of what we're supposed to be responsible for. So in the church, certainly, this shame has got me sitting in the back row. I'm not qualified to be involved in church because I've got this secret sin in my life, even if my wife doesn't know about it. Can you talk to that? Both of you talk to that. And Bob, I'm sure you know how that feels and how that made you feel. You said that you were not wanting to hurt Dannah by revealing this to her, but there wasn't much you could really do otherwise other than just to tell her. Yeah,
and I totally get, like, one of the things that I look back on is, I was just telling somebody today, telling the school that we started, I was telling the student body there, that there were times when in that sanctuary I'd take communion, I'd take it in one door and walk out the other and throw it away because I knew I couldn't take it with integrity. Wow. And I felt like that outsider. When there were messages on sin, separating us from God, I was like, here's where I'm at. And, I was still a spiritual leader. I was still a leader. And what's sad for me is that because I had some because I was being convicted internally by the Holy Spirit, I kind of voluntarily took myself out of things. Mm-hmm. And sometimes I thought, boy, if I wasn't so convicted, this wouldn't bother me so much. I could be a leader in church. There was times when Dannah would say, wow, you're the best husband. Mm-hmm. And I would think, that's like a curse. She doesn't have any idea how she's getting 10% of what I could be as a husband, being present, things like that. And I'm tricking her, and she doesn't really know me, if she really did know me. But a lot of guys with a good relationship with Christ or with the conviction of the Holy Spirit, we take ourselves on the sidelines because that's kind of the right thing to do. It would be even more right to be in a group with community and be confessing our sins. But, I was a ministry leader. So I had to go eventually to my board and say, I've fallen below the standards of where I need to be. I need to step down for a while. And I think because we had established ministries of grace and we were in a community of graceful people, they worked with me. And I stayed out longer than they asked me to do just because I felt like as a leader that's what I should do, to be above reproach. But I find that a lot of leaders, spiritual leaders, couldn't really go tell their church or they'd be fired. And that's really a difficult thing. A lot of spiritual leaders who want to get better, so they live in this clash of spirit internally. They don't talk about it as much because they don't want to be hypocrites. They don't want to teach on it. And it's really it's a tough thing spiritually. And yet it's ubiquitous all around us in everything we do. And it really requires a real committed response.
I think it's one of the greatest mission fields of our era. Can you imagine what would happen? It's not just that the church looks at pornography as a problem. Many of the porn addiction clinics around the country are not Christian models. You have people like Russell Brand coming out and saying, this is bad stuff. Don't do this stuff. It'll fry your brain. So imagine if the church began to be the place where people were set free.
Amen.
Well, that's not going to happen until we start to get honest about it.
That's right.
And until we start to give everybody the clinical care as well as the biblical care they need and incorporate that with the power of the Holy Spirit and prayer.
Wow, that's so good. And I say that so often. Since I started at Covenant Eyes, I'm seeing this, and it's right in front of our eyes, but nobody talks about it. Nobody really wants to admit it. And let's face it, there are pastors behind the pulpit that are fearful of losing their job if they talk about something so secular, But it's a cancer in the church that is destroying it, and we want to turn our heads and pretend like it's not there. And I'm not really criticizing anyone because I understand, but it's time to dig in and say, this is something we need to call out. It is sin. Maybe addiction, but like you said, this is sin. Let's call it for what it is, and let's start fighting back. And you guys are doing that, and I appreciate that so much. What else can you tell us about the book? There's so much in there. Is there anything in particular that you want to share with the audience? Man, so many good things. I just want to say really quickly here, plug, get this book. It really is. If you're struggling or you know someone who's struggling, this is an eye-opener. It's not just another book that will make you feel good at the end. This is really substance. And it will help you to understand what's going on behind this. This is evil. This is plain and simple evil. That is, Satan's doing a great job in this area, and nobody wants to talk about it. So it's just absolutely rampant in our society.
Yeah.
So great stuff.
Thanks. Yeah, and if it's a book for women. We are hearing a lot of men the wives can't get the book because the men are reading it. They want to know how their wives think. I get that. I've read a lot of books that are written for men, so I can understand how Bob's thinking about this.
Yeah.
But the podcast we created for the husbands and the wives to listen to together. I think one of the things that was a real learning curve for us is that in many cases, when it has become addictive, I would say, and by addiction I mean there's some sort of cycle. Maybe it's daily, maybe it's weekly, maybe it's monthly, maybe it's quarterly, but this individual who's using the pornography just can't, they want to stop. They hate their sin, but they can't stop. Okay, you are under the control of something rather than in control of it, right? So when it gets to that point, there's any kind of addiction or cycle, you don't just need biblical care, although you cannot divorce the power of God from the process because it's a sin problem, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And only Jesus is capable of dealing with sin. You're not going to find that in behavioral science or psychology. You need Jesus to overcome sin. But many times, Christian couples make the mistake of not also getting clinical care. And by that, I mean somebody that understands what addiction will do to your brain, the physiological impact. And also, like, I needed somebody that understood what trauma was doing to my heart and my mind, too, because my brain wasn't working very well. And a lot of times, you can do damage in helping a couple because you don't understand the clinical needs. It's the same person in your church who is great at helping you work out how you fight about how to put the toilet paper on the roll in the toilet in the bathroom, or the fact that your husband
it's the
other way, or the socks that your husband puts on the floor every night and you have to pick up. Like the person that's great at helping you with that problem is probably most likely going to be in over their heads.
Yeah.
Unless they themselves have walked a path like this and understand the clinical complexities of pornography addiction. So I think we're trying to get the church to wake up to the fact that, yes, Freud was crazy, and he is probably at the root of a lot of our sexual unwellness in our culture. You can trace a lot of our sexual unwellness back to him because he thought sex was our greatest need. But he and other psychologists have given us tools to diagnose things that aren't necessarily entirely evil in and of themselves. It depends on whose hands those tools are in. And so if those tools are in the right hands with biblical care and prayer, they're great tools for diagnosing a problem and understanding how to apply God's truth. And I think sometimes people are allergic to the clinical care aspect. And on the other side, some people just go after the clinical care and they forget to integrate God's truth into it. And that neither of those approaches work well.
Well, and one of the things that happens that I am aware of, and I felt a lot, like I said before, is you're singing songs, in worship, set me free from my chains. I just had the lyrics, but
the lyrics just ran right out of your head.
Yeah.
I know those lyrics.
Yeah, it's, and when you're in this spiritual battle, you really notice those words. You notice what you're singing. You notice the promises people are making with the power of God, and you don't feel it. And that is a real battle for your faith, because you can say, oh yeah, you can say that the Holy Spirit is this and that, and God, there's no condemnation, whatever, but it certainly doesn't feel like that. And I think that the sad thing about that is when you need your faith bolstered, it feels like it's not there. And so what it takes is being in community. And I've just been cognizant lately, I guess, doing interviews and stuff about how, I don't know how to say this, how much the church is worried about behavior modification. And I think that at the point where somebody can say, hey, I was struggling with this last week, or I did this, on Tuesday and it's Thursday, and I need to confess this and share it. I think there is a need for that in the church, that men can confess, that they can be honest about their life, and have a community that supports them. It's a complicated issue. There's no question about it. But I love the 12-step model. I think the 12 steps are, amazing. There was a time when I was going to 3 12-step meetings a week. There weren't necessarily other Christians there, but they found God eventually, a lot of them. But they were, they were supporting each other. They were sharing their stories. One of the very interesting things that happens is when you go into a 12-step meeting for the first time, there could be 40 people in the room. But when you walk in as a newcomer, the meeting totally changes. You get out a different set of scripts, and it's testimony time for everybody. Everybody says how they got to be here. Totally change. It's like, wow, that's not part of the content we were supposed to do tonight. But by the time it gets around to that guy, there's probably about 12 people in our group. By the time I get around to him, he was telling us things he'd never told anybody else in the world. Yeah. Because we had been open and honest. And it helped me. It helped me a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah, we talk about safe places in our churches, and I just don't think that we can just say that our churches are a safe place to talk about pornography, even in small group. I think that it's still taboo enough, and I think that's a part of the problem, is that, I remember a conversation my wife and I had going down the road one time. It was in a city, and some guy was dressed up crazy. This was years ago, shortly after we got married. And the conversation, how conversations just go off on tangents, and all of a sudden the conversation went to, well, what if a naked woman was walking down the road? Would you look at her? And I said, well, yeah. And my wife has still not forgotten that years ago, because there is the God-given and there is the perversion. And our society has blurred that line so much with stuff on TV, even commercials, that we feel like we don't even know what's pure anymore. That virtual reality is going to basically even further that pornography issue, because you don't need to have sex with a person, and there's that disconnect between the way God created sex to be and what society is portraying it to be, and what it is right now. And so it is a struggle. I think we just need to get in our churches and let our pastors know that we support them talking about this issue. And and for ministries like you guys have, and taking your story, which it's got to be tough to talk about those things. Bob, I got to ask: is this still an issue for you, or are you cured?
I'm not cured. I think it's something I have to have very high boundaries around. I do use Covenant Eyes. I don't travel alone unless it's absolutely unavoidable, and I have to be very careful about what I look at, about being in community. And even as we started, to be honest with you, even as we started this thing the last 3 or 4 months, I realized, man, I better get back into some of the habits I had, because this is really hard for me. I mean, I wonder if someday I'll be able to look back at this and be like, yeah, I was that and I was that, but I don't think it'll ever get very easy for me to share the story. It's
Sure.
But no, I'm not cured. I think my brain is better. And maybe some people need to hear that there's a cure and it all goes away. And I've been struggling with that story. But it's not my story. Now, many people that I know tell somebody and they get it out and they're healed. But I talk about addiction kind of like food. I know I'm overweight. I know what it takes to get to a proper weight right now, today. I know exactly what to eat. Exactly. Easy. It's not complicated. I know exactly what to say no to. And yet I will say yes to things over and over again. And I think a lot of people can identify that that kind of temptation, which is like you just constantly making wrong choices with what you eat every meal.
That's me.
Or and you're like, I know what to do.
This is the man who came to bed last night with an ice cream cone in his hand.
Oh, that sounds like me, Bob.
They were little for our grandkids, so I had two. She doesn't know, but anyway. I just even last night I was like, this is a bad choice. Yeah. It wouldn't normally be in the house for the grandkids, and they're and I think, man, I make bad choices all the time with food, for instance, when I know that I shouldn't. And the times between meals, it's pretty easy. Yeah. Right?
Yeah.
So I think that the answer to your question is no, I'm not healed. Yes, we have to be cognizant of the fact that I have to have boundaries, and that's very harmful to my marriage. I want to just say that was a loaded question. I think in those very rare instances where God can just instantly, save someone from that addiction, it is very rare. My pastor one time when I was younger told a group of guys, he said, if you think that you don't struggle with lust, you're either lying or you're castrated. And I think that's just an issue that we deal with lifelong. And I think that was something that stuck in my mind, because for him to say this, a guy that I respected so highly, this is a struggle you have. And I think that's what we have to come to terms with for anyone who struggles with pornography is this is not a shameful thing. You just need, and your book says it well, and you mentioned it, community. We need to lay this before the Lord and be in community in safe places where we can talk about this issue and accountability. And I think a lot of people will, read the book and they could assume, hey, that everything's fantastic now, everything's healed. There are still consequences to things I did. There's still triggers for Dannah at times when...
let me say something about that, though.
Okay, go ahead.
Triggers were really painful for me at a certain point. And I think, for anybody who's triggered by anything, you have to know when to give yourself grace. Because, I can't handle that. That's too much for me right now. That brings up too much pain. I'm not healed enough. But then, as God begins to heal you, triggers have become, for me, an invitation to a deeper healing. So where I'm like, I'm in a safe relationship now, and that still hurts. So I wonder what God is illuminating. And I drill down deep into that area. And there are so many things. Like, for example, when we were going through the worst of this, there was a song I used, a worship song that I used to comfort myself. And I loved that song. And then as we progressed in our healing, every time I heard that worship song, it reminded me of that pain, right? Well, just a few months ago, the song came on the radio or whatever, and I was like, I'm worshiping. I'm not triggered. But that's because I went to the song and I said, okay, Lord, what's your truth about this? But Bob is different. He is a different person. I keep telling him, your brain is healing. Yeah. If it's true, and I believe that it is, that a porn addict's brain looks like Swiss cheese, there's some functional deficits there that, thank the Lord, like our lungs can heal, our brains are malleable. They can recover with time, and as you retrain them and as you put the right things into them. And he's calmer. There was a lot of simmering anger in his heart that it felt like maybe he was a volcano just about to go off. He never was the kind of man that like was abusive or exploded, but there was something there that I was just like, wonder if I need to walk on eggshells today. That's for the most part gone. I mean, we both still have our stuff. We're not perfect, but I can see God's healing in just the manner in which he interacts with life.
Yeah.
So there's hope.
I used to have a lot of triggers, a lot of things that went on throughout my day, and I do notice now there's not a lot of memories I have anymore. There's not a lot of things that, and every guy is going to understand this, where you can be listening to worship music and all of a sudden drive by and see something and it immediately kind of gets you into the zone where you're like, what? How did this happen? That happens a lot less to me, and I praise God for that. I used to be able to conjure up memories and get that dopamine hit just from the memories, but in 12 Steps they have a couple catchphrases, and one of them is one day at a time. So in my life, I find it to be kind of one day at a time. I have to be careful. I'm not like, oh, this is great, I can go do whatever I want now, I can go travel. I just don't feel... there's a safety for me within boundaries.
Yeah. That
the boundaries are safe for me, and I used to push against them all the time, like, don't you trust me, don't you do whatever.
Sure.
And now I find them a source of safety that puts some fences up where I need fences.
Yeah, we have
Boundaries
conversations
are good.
we should have had conversation. We had 10 years ago, if I'd have said, you're driving from here to there, who knows, who are you talking to? And we might have an unpleasant conversation, or I might just be afraid to do it because he's in a mood or whatever. And now, if he's going to, by requirement, I have to fly from here to there or whatever, I'll be like, have you talked to Mark? Have you talked to Jim? And he'll be like, yep, they know. And we're in touch. And it's just how we do life. It's our tether to, I guess, intimacy, because they're hard conversations to have sometimes. They're not as hard anymore.
No, I used to get really upset, and I think it was out of shame. It kind of felt shaming. And one of the big differences in my life where I really took responsibility for what I'd done to Dannah. And part of what has actually helped me is her use of the word that she feels safe. It's not about I don't trust you, but when you do this, it makes me feel safe. And that's a feeling I want her to have. And I think when I started to take responsibility for what I had done to her, I have a kind of an interesting story. One day when she wasn't here, I cleaned the whole house. She was coming back. I'm like, I'm going to clean the house. She's going to be so impressed. She's going to walk in. And when she walked in, she was, what were you?
Triggered.
She was triggered. And I was like, what? And she's like, this is what you did after you acted out. You kind of wanted to do penance and you did all kinds of things for me. And so what I say is I've never let that happen again. I've never triggered her that way again. But I had to realize, in the past I would have gotten upset about that. Then I realized, yes, I did plant triggers like that. And I had to take responsibility for them. And that's made our conversations a lot easier because there's a humility in that.
Well, one of the things that we've really been able to help a lot of couples with is understanding the difference between forgiveness and trust. Forgiveness is me releasing Bob and putting God in charge of any kind of judgment or penance, because only God alone knows the depths of Bob's heart, and that's not my job. My job, according to Scripture, is to forgive him. Now, premature forgiveness I don't think is healthy, and sometimes I think I see that being forced in the church. Oh, all the guys do this. You just need to forgive him. That makes me mad.
Yeah.
There needs to be thorough, divulging of how far the addiction has gone. There has to be truth on the table, and that has to be done with the right clinical and biblical caretakers so that it's a safe experience. And then you forgive, and you don't do it till you really mean it. That's my opinion. I'm not saying you don't forgive. I'm saying you know what you're forgiving. and your heart is in the right posture to do it well. And sometimes a wife's brain is too traumatized to do it right away, and she needs the grace of some time to bandage her own wounds. But that same day, she doesn't have to say, I trust you, because the Bible actually warns us against trusting in mere humans. The only entity we're ever told to trust is to trust in the name of our Lord our God. He's the only one we can truly ever trust. He's the only one that's not going to let us down.
Amen.
In our humanity, we do. And so trust is built in small little increments, in steps. And as Bob goes to the 12-step meeting, as Bob makes the phone calls to his accountability guys, as Bob talks honestly and doesn't get defensive when we talk about this, then I start to have something to trust. And I think that I can defend that biblically. And that's been safe for us. It's been safe for me. It's been safe for him. Blind trust is not a gift to him. It's empowering. It's codependency.
Yeah. I think that's really important to mention because for those that are in the situation you were in, Dannah, I think a lot of advice is, like you said, you just need to learn to forgive. But that doesn't help anybody. And again, this is in your book. Get a hold of the book. Read more in depth on that because that's a very important topic. And I struggle even today, outside of porn issue, it's anything that deals with forgiveness and trust. There's a delicate balance there because, I can forgive some people, but I can't trust them. And it's important to distinguish between the two. So
the other thing I would say is that you have to have trusted friends around you in all areas of your life, for your whole life. But in your marriage, you have to have people who can tell you hard things, whether it's the husband or the wife, and stick with you. The book is just a book. Like, okay, we think it's a good book. It'll help. But to enact the things in the book just to be able to establish trust and establish forgiveness and stuff, sometimes it takes a few other people to say, okay, now it's time to forgive, and or you know what, he's crying, he's saying he's sorry, but he doesn't look repentant to us. Because it's easy to cry. It's easy to cry and apologize. And for many years, I thought that was enough. I'm sorry. What more do you want me to say? One of the big responses we're getting from the book is guys saying, the wife is saying, my husband said he's sorry. It happened a month ago. It'll never happen again. Stop bugging me about it. And I've been there. And I realize now that was a really selfish place for me to be because I am responsible for, I think, putting in safe boundaries and allowing her to speak into them. Because I want to be a person of integrity. I want to be a person of integrity. So she can help me and people around me can help me.
Boy, secrets in marriage are not a good thing. And so to have that openness and to be able to be transparent with one another as spouses is so important. I'm really grateful for your ministry, what you guys do, for both of you being able to be transparent and share this really sensitive subject and parts of your lives that nobody wants to share. But boy, you're helping a lot of people to understand through your example that speaking out is the start of forgiveness and healing and all those things that need to happen in a marriage. And I've just been really disheartened. You watch the news at all, there's just a lot of stuff going on in our society today. We're just tail spinning right now, and I think that Satan loves to attack the family. That's where God started everything, and if he can tear apart the family, he can tear apart our society. And I think this is a big part of tearing that family structure apart and our marriages apart is through this secret sin of pornography. So thank you both so much for sharing. Are there anything you want to end with as we wrap up our time?
Just that there is hope. I mean, you may feel broken beyond repair, but with Jesus, there's always hope. He doesn't just fix it. Redemption is making it better than it was before. And yes. I feel that way about our marriage.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Agreed. I think that you mentioned something about, I don't remember the quote, but about pain. And it was so true, because we look at pain as something that's bad, but when we're going through it, there can be redemption in situations like you guys walked through. And you're seeing that now and sharing that with others. And so I thank you both so much for doing that, because that gives us hope. Bob and Dannah, thank you so much for your time. I know you're very busy. Love your ministry. We'll put all of the stuff I can in the show notes so people can find your website, how to get your book, all the things that you're involved in. And again, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks, Mike.
Take care.